being around that, I just thought, is this normal? Is this normal for her? Is this what all my teammates are going to be like? Everyone must think I'm a very fat cow, weighing in at 67 kilos as I did then. They must think I'm not committed enough.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, a podcast where I have candid conversations with fascinating people. If you're okay living a life of frequent and often crushing disappointment, you should really consider becoming a professional cyclist. That's the advice Dr Bridie O'Donnell was given by a fellow cyclist when she decided to make cycling her career. And this is even weirder than it sounds, because she was not at the point in her life where you would expect someone to choose the path of professional athlete. She was 32 years old, a doctor, and as one coach told her bluntly, she was too old, too fat, and too slow to make it in one of the toughest, most physically and emotionally demanding sports on earth. But make it, she did. Bridie became a world record breaker after taking an astonishing leap of faith, with no previous history in the sport, when she decided to become an elite cyclist. What happened to her along the way was literally a matter of life and death. It made her stare down her worst fears, confront her own mortality, and learn when it was time to let go of a dream. Life and Death is the name of Bridie's memoir, which she says she wrote to inspire anyone who's been told their best days are behind them, or been discouraged from believing that hard work and persistence might just allow them to realise their dreams. Bridie, welcome to No Filter.
I'm so thrilled to be here.
It's so lovely to meet you. I gave you such a big hug because you and I have history. And when your name came up as a possible interview subject for No Filter, I was like, that name sounds familiar. And we met over cycling. We met actually over email. In fact, I went on the Today Show the day that Cadel Evans won the Tour de France and sounded off about cyclists not being heroes and the fact that he was just paid a lot of money to ride a bike and what was heroic about that. And you wrote an open letter in the Herald Sun and you contacted me, and I really appreciated the tone you took and the time you took to thoughtfully explain to me why for some people cyclists are heroes and what Cadel Evans' victory on that day had meant to you as a professional cyclist.
It was such a remarkable thing. I remember watching when they had the homecoming parade for him at Fed Square, and I was in Italy and having a really challenging year. I was in this crappy team with an abusive director, and I wasn't getting to do the races that I needed to do to try and qualify for World Championships. And I was sort of sitting there on my crappy little couch eating my salad to try and get skinny, and I just cried the whole time. I cried all the way through the last few days of the tour and when he was back in Melbourne. Because I think what a lot of the time sporting greatness, it's like artistic greatness. It says to us, oh my God, I'm seen. People see me. They can see that I'm great. They can see all that hard work I've put into it. It's why you cry when you watch A Star Is Born and Lady Gaga gets up on the stage, because there's this unrecognised, unrealised ambition. And when you win, that's just the culmination of it. And so he was living a dream for so many people who never win.
So it was a happy cry.
Totally happy crying.
As a woman in this sport, I would look at it and say, it's so interesting to me that you felt seen, I guess, as a cyclist. But as a woman, where are the women in the Tour de France? I mean, they're on the podium, dressed in short skirts, giving kisses to the winner at each stage. But how do you feel seen in a sport that doesn't see you in so many ways?
It's really challenging, and that's where the danger is for the athletes, because there's no advocacy. They're not getting paid any money. They don't have a profile. So then when things go badly, there's no one that sort of cares about that. So you're a very vulnerable population group. And you're not on the back pages of La Gazzetta or L'Equipe in France or Italy. And there's been a history with the Tour. There was a Tour de France where the women rode exactly the same stages as the men. It was back in the 80s. It was a hardcore. There was probably some women like Jeannie Longo, infamous French cyclist, who was also associated with doping for a very long period of time. She still raced into her 50s. But then things fell away. And as often is the case, and we see this even now in women's professional sport, is whomever is the broadcaster or whomever is the sponsor says, these men are high profile, that's why we'll invest in the men's BBL. And it's only been in the last couple of years where they say, actually, these athletes are awesome too. And look how great the WBBL is. You don't have to be a cricket fan to get into that. So that's where the challenge is. We as athletes would say, well, put us on TV and broadcast the races. Then you'll see how cool it is.
And the AFL has found that.
Totally. Tennis has found that for many years, and certainly, trailblazers like Billie Jean King have helped that process. But she had to take a massive risk, a pay cut, a risk of speculation into her personal life. Not many people have that sort of sense of courage that she did.
So becoming a professional athlete, when you think about someone who does, you think about a child prodigy, someone who starts hitting a ball on a tennis court at age 4, someone who grew up competing through school. You were 32. Tell me about 32-year-old Bridie. Where was your life at, and what on earth drew you to cycling?
I'd been a failed athlete in so many other sports. I think finding the right sport for you is like finding the right relationship. You go out with people, you think this is totally going to work, and then it doesn't. So I'd done Ironman triathlon. I was good. I'd done rowing. I was good, but I wasn't great. I wanted to be an Olympian. And I was part of a talent transfer process in the AIS, and they were looking at athletes with certain physiological capabilities. So I went along, and I wasn't even the best one there either.
You didn't really care what you competed in. You just wanted to compete. You had that hunger, or
no,
was there
really
something
committed.
about cycling that you loved?
It was that it suited me at the time, and then I was paired up with an amazing coach, this woman called Donna Zielinski in Geelong. And so it was a right time and place. I'd also taken time out of full-time work to study for medical exams. So to become a specialist, you just give the colleges a shitload of money, and then they examine you and fail you a lot of times, and then after a few years you become a specialist. And I was doing that. So I had some time to devote to it. And then I realised this is for me. This is a sport, particularly time trialling. It's a sport where you have to be mentally tough. You have to be relentless. You had to be big and strong. And I thought, this is it. I could go to Beijing Olympics. So I risked everything.
So you're a doctor. What kind of a doctor were you?
A physician. Yeah.
And why couldn't you just do sport on the weekends or after work or before work like
everybody else?
Yeah.
Because I'm an idiot, for one reason. Secondly, because I didn't have any of that talent as a young kid. I feel like talent is such a superficial assessment. You walk in the room and I decide, she might make a good lightweight rower. She could have been a gymnast, might need a bit more explosive power. Like, it's all based on superficial qualities that people make a very quick assessment of. And you do talent ID at school, and if you don't have a vertical jump that's good enough, you're basically pushed to the side and not talented. There's no medium ground, particularly with girls, and we're seeing that now, that they're either awesome or they don't do it at all. And yet I was the worst kind of Australian because I was a try-hard. I just kept trying. I had no giftedness, and I'd be the captain of the C team, and I'd be in the B division of everything and never winning anything. But I wanted to be exceptional. And I wanted to be the most amazing athlete, even though my dad had played a bit of rugby and my mum had played a bit of netball. We weren't a family of athletes. So I just had an unshakable desire, and medicine wasn't giving that to me.
What was the point at which you had to choose?
I remember distinctly this amazing night in France. I was doing a job interview to get onto the College of Sports Medicine. I'd passed my exam. It was 2 a.m. Paris time, and I'd just come second in an enormous race. And they were offering, they were interviewing me, and I was thinking, if I do well, I'll get a place on the training program. They only offer 3 doctors in the country this spot. And I just won this and coming up with the national champs, and I thought, I don't know if I want to do this more than try and go to the Olympics and be a professional bike rider. So I went through the motions. I got offered a place, which was amazing, and then I won the Oceania Championships and the National Championships. And the national team said, do you want to come and live in Italy and earn €20 a week and live in a bunk bed? Or the college was saying, do you want to do the thing that you've been preparing for and training for and studying for and being a good, sensible doctor?
And earn a fortune.
And you don't earn a fortune actually as a junior doctor, but you've got a pathway.
You've got a pathway to a fortune.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's changing. It's a pretty brutal industry. I mean, I'm not saying you've got a stable income for the rest of your life, no doubt. The stability is the thing, I think. But I just took the
bunk bed. And how much is €20?
Oh, back then it was $25, $30.
Wow. Help me to understand, because obviously as a person who isn't sporty, what is the drive that makes people like you different to people like me, where I'm active and I go for runs and everything like that, and I'm very competitive in other aspects of my life? What is it that makes you, is it the pursuit of, and I say this without any judgment, is it the pursuit of money, recognition, fame? What is it?
I think it can be all those things in the same way that being an artist or a writer or a bank manager can be all those things.
That's true.
And in fact, that's what I remember talking about in my letter to you was that I remember you'd commented about heroes being doctors and firefighters.
Social workers and service providers.
I remember saying to you, I know a lot of really selfish doctors. I know a lot of mean firefighters that want to be in calendars, and work shift work. That's a joke. They don't all want to be in calendars, of course, but they are very handsome, and the women. But what I think is that everyone has very different reasons and values. For me, I wanted to be recognised for my work. So I'm a pure workaholic in that I want to work very hard at something and then I want people to say, good job. So I was the
I
kind of...
we all want that, don't we?
So for me, I was physically manifesting my work, which is I'm going to ride at the front of a peloton. I'm going to be the strongest, and then my team member will go up and win the race, and then it will be because of me and 4 or 5 other women in the team that got her to be great. Because cycling is that ultimate team sport. It's like working for a famous person. The famous person gets the kudos, and then there's people out here that are helping create content or writing speeches, and they're kind of invisible, but she can't do it without them. So it's a very similar process.
Explain to me how cycling's a team sport.
It's a hard one, isn't it? Because we see the hockey-roos when they win. They're all on the podium and everyone gets a medal. So in cycling, everyone has a role. So in many ways, it is like a business. Someone is the designated leader. She might be the best climber or the best sprinter. Or in the Tour de France, he might be the guy who's got the most likely chance to be at the top at the end of 3 weeks. But everyone has a job to do, which is like when we get to the climbs, Mia, you're gonna look after Frankie, and she's going to be protected. You're going to give her water bottles if she needs them. You're going to give her a jacket if it starts raining. If she punctures, you're going to give her your wheel. So you are truly...
While I'm riding.
Yeah, and then you wait back in the end and you've been dropped and you have to get a new wheel or you have to get bottles. And we've seen even in the Tour de France riders going back to a car and shoving 10 water bottles down their jersey, and then they have to ride back through the peloton back up and say to Chris Froome, hi. And he says, no, not Gatorade. And you go back to the car like it's...
So he's the star. He's the famous
Absolutely.
one. Does every team have a star?
So they all have someone they're riding for, but their purpose might be different. So there might be in the Tour de France, for example, there's 21 teams. There might be 7 or 8 teams that really think their guy could win. There might be other teams who think our guy could win the sprinter's jersey. So he's crazy fast. We're going to put all our energy into that. Famously, the Tour de France actually got recognition by being ridden by young men who had no fame and talent, but who were broadcasting. I mean, it was the first way sponsorship was brought into sport. And we see this now. The reason for 6 or 7 blokes to be out at the front on their own for 5 hours is actually to advertise, Mamma Mia on the jersey. So there's 6 hours of advertising time that goes to maybe 2 billion people all over the world. And then they get caught at the end and people go, oh, no, they got caught at the end. The whole thing's it's orchestrated, to demonstrate different things throughout the day.
So Cadell had a team. It wasn't just him.
Absolutely. He had 8 support riders, many of whom we'll never know the names of, and they're all specialists at what they do. Protective, fast, reassuring. It's psychologically testing 3 weeks. And for Cadell, everyone knew that he'd been a brilliant rider who could have won many years before, but he'd never been in the right team with the right combination, the right support from above, the right mechanics. A lot has to fall into place, not crashing. That's why I think cycling fans are so passionate, because it's quite beautiful, it's tantalising, it's heartbreaking. You invest for 3 weeks in that particular race, or in spring classics, you're investing in the cobbled classics like Paris-Roubaix.
Does everyone want to be, what do you call that person?
The GC rider, the general classification rider.
The GC rider. Everyone wants to be like the hero of the team.
Not everyone has that capacity. So I rode in an Italian team, and our GC rider was a teeny tiny little climber, La Piccolina, and she weighed 42 kilos. I'm never going to be that girl that can win a mountaintop finish. But she needs me to protect her for the 100K before we get to the Stelvio.
And what does protecting her look like?
Well, the words domestique, it kind of means slave. So when you look at a bunch of people
this is
riding,
like such fun.
I know. Am I selling it or what? Get yourself down there. Then we haven't even got talking about injuries or saddle sores.
You're a slave.
I am a slave, and your job is to make sure that she's in the right position in the bunch. That if she crashes, you're there to actually help her get back and make contact again, to make sure she's not at the front. You want to be near the front but not on the front.
Gosh, it's selfless.
It's really selfless. But that being said, for some men, because it's professionalised, they can make a great living. So Matthew Heyman, you may have heard of him. He won Paris-Roubaix 3 years ago. He'd spent 17 years never winning a bike race. He's just a professional domestique, and that man is amazing, a lovely man, but an incredibly talented, hardworking, big, strong rider. He's ridden for multiple teams, and he's your guy that you get. He's calm, he's confident, he knows what's going on, doesn't take shit from anyone, but respected. So that it's like having a lieutenant. It's like going to a war.
Tell me about the injuries.
Yeah, there's just a lot of crashes. So there's a lot of unpredictability, and you crash in training, you crash in races, you break bones, you lose a lot of skin, then you stick to the sheets at night. Women get a lot of saddle sores, men do too, but, and they're not well treated, so you have infection and, pain and overuse injuries, and it's not cool. And then you get tan lines, and they look crazy. So you look great in cycling clothing and pretty crazy in any other type of clothing.
Gosh, you'd have to love it.
You do love it. But you also, like any sport, you realise how selfish it is. It's a bubble that you live in, even more a bubble than the Canberra bubble, because everyone around you talks the same language. They've all got the similar aspiration. They're all experiencing, like, which team can I go to next year? How can this be better? But you're all physically tired all the time. I mean, there's some great books about pro cycling, and Daniel Coyle's written a great book about Lance Armstrong in 04-05. He interviews a lot of the women who are married to pro cyclists, and they say it's kind of like being married to a very big baby, that they don't want to walk anywhere. You live in Girona and they don't want to walk anywhere. They're on a particular type of diet. Well, they don't want to waste any energy. They just want to spend their energy on the riding, the training, and then they come home and they rest. So they're like racehorses, and that's a challenging lifestyle.
And what about the women's partners?
The women's partners are either women who also race, and therefore they're in and around them, and that can create its own challenging dynamic in a team. We've seen that with AFLW, and it's not something that AFLM have had to navigate yet, as men having intimate relationships with men who are in teams. But certainly in women's teams, there's a lot of really good safety around same-sex relationships. But that being said, if for most women who are straight, you've got a male partner, he's either a bike rider and he lives maybe in your country, but for most Australian women, their partners live back here. So then you're spending 6-7 months on Skype trying to keep a relationship alive, and that's really challenging.
Do many of them have kids?
I had a teammate who had kids, 2 young children, and she was an extraordinary bike rider. Her husband and 2 kids lived in Townsville, and she'd Skype them. We'd be having breakfast in Italy in the morning, and they'd be, getting ready for bed or something in Australia. But she copped a lot of criticism, like, how can you leave your children like that? And she was going back really frequently, every 6 weeks. But it's very hard, really hard. Not many have kids.
And if you want to be a pro cyclist, you have to live in Europe, is that right?
Absolutely. Or the US. The US has a growing scene, but definitely that's where all the teams are. And for most women, because you're not making a salary, the major aspiration is to qualify for Olympics or Worlds. And you need to do that by racing in Europe on the races that are likely to be selected.
So you're doing all of this for free?
Most people are, yeah. There's no minimum wage in women's cycling.
How can people afford to do that?
Well, they have generous parents, generous partners. They draw down on their mortgage like me, or they might be on a salary. I was on a monster salary of about €15,000 in my second year, and I was thinking that I was living large.
That's how much Aussie?
$25,000, and that doesn't pay for, then you've got to pay for everything that you're buying if you want to live not in a bunk bed team house with 8 other Italian girls.
Were most of the people in your team younger than you?
Yeah, I was really old. And not old because I'd been doing it a long time, old because I was late entry.
So were you a bit of a anomaly, a curiosity figure for them?
Yeah, I was. And my challenges were then I was impatient. So I wasn't just over there to try and live the dream and, Diane Lane under the Tuscan sun. I wanted to go to Olympics and Worlds, and yet I was around all these girls that had way more time than me and probably were more reflective about, what do you care? Bridie, why are you getting so upset about performing badly? And I think because I've given up my job, my relationship, to do this. And also you realise if you're a person who likes to communicate and connect with people with language, how stifling it is when you don't speak the language. So I learned to speak Italian really well by the end of the second year. But early on, I think I was just saying si and no and what time is training like a 3-year-old. And it's really isolating.
You mentioned that your relationship broke down. You'd been married when you started pro cycling, and you and your husband decided to divorce. So you were single, living in Italy. Good time to be a lady, if you're straight. Yes?
Well, no, here I was thinking there would be handsome, dashing Italian men. I did go on a few dates when I was over in Italy, and I have to say they work on a numbers game. So they say, Mia, you are so beautiful.
Che bella.
Che bella. Do you want to make love with me? And if you spend 7 seconds too long going, I don't know, Fabrizio, he would literally turn to the next girl right there and say, Bridie, you are so beautiful. And you think, I'm standing right here. And you go, okay, cool, no worries, I'll try the same. And also the men were very beautiful, like so pretty.
Oh, crazy beautiful.
And they smell beautiful, but then you meet them for dinner and they're an hour and a half late because they've been getting so beautiful.
Much fragrance. I lived in Italy for a year and my boyfriend, he would keep spare fragrances in the glove box of his car.
Good.
He had a wardrobe of fragrances.
Just in case. Did he have beautiful hair too?
Yeah, he did. But every time I'd get in the car with him, I would be drenched in the smell of his fragrance. And I'd just be like, what's the point of me wearing any perfume?
You just rub up against him like a magazine.
That's
thing.
right.
Yeah,
just
put
walk
it on
past
your
him and I'd smell very strong. You mentioned the GC in your team being 42 kilos. You write in your book about body image and how that is such a little discussed factor in terms of female pro athletes. What's it like in cycling?
It can be really toxic because the lighter you are in weight overall, the quicker you go up a mountain, and your power versus your weight is beneficial. So if you and I and a 40-kilo person and a 100-kilo person were riding our bikes up a hill, irrespective of fitness, the smallest person is most likely to get up to the quickest. And then when you're comparing the best cyclist in the world, the skinniest, lightest woman who can still generate power, so they're not medically unwell, but they have eating disordered behaviour and they're rewarded for staying skinny, and your stomach fat gets grabbed by the team director on a daily basis, or they say, maybe Bridie, maybe you shouldn't eat so much pasta, and you think it's the night before stage 4 of the women's Giro d'Italia, a 10-day stage race. And also not eating now is not going to make me lose weight tomorrow. I need the energy. So being a doctor and being in an environment where pseudoscience was being extorted by some of these people in charge, and also just some myths, you'd sit there and you'd have a big bowl of vegetables and a girl would be eating 1 cube of Parmesan and she'd say, Bridie, you eat too much. And you think, well, I'm eating low-calorie food. You're eating cheese and olive oil. The calorific kind of contents of these things. And I used to start to try and explain these things in my shitty Italian, and then I realised they don't want to know. They want me to be helpful when it's helpful to them, but otherwise I should just shut up.
You talked about one of your teammates who had very disordered eating, as you described it. You talked about her eating like an apple for breakfast. How do you then go and cycle all day without any fuel?
That was a really traumatic experience, and I tried in the book to be careful about that, but one of the things I realised is for many of us, when we live with people who are actually mentally ill, the impact it has on us, whether we have a partner with depression or anxiety, or I've spoken to men I know who've had partners who've been bulimic. So it's truly awful for the person suffering, but it's really tricky to navigate for the person in their life. Do I talk about this every day? Do I address it? Do I ignore it? Am I being complicit in this toxicity?
What did you observe?
The challenge for me was I didn't speak Russian. She barely spoke Italian, and this was clearly her MO every year, was that she arrived at the start of a season very unhappy about how much she weighed. She and I shared a room together because we were the only non-Italians. She would get up every morning, take off all her clothes, stand naked on a pair of scales, and she was my height and 15 kilos lighter than me, and she would look at the scales, and on the scales next to where the number would pop up would be her mark there written, that what she needed to weigh. And if she didn't weigh it, she'd burst into tears and then get back into bed, stay in bed for a few hours, and then finally she'd get up, have black coffee, have an apple, and then go riding for 5 hours. And she'd do that super slow, so she's efficient as an athlete, and it's like if you went for a walk for 5 hours, you can do it. But I just felt, to what end, and this woman ended up being a national champion for her country. She competed incredibly well at World Championships. She ended up actually returning a positive doping test not that long ago. And for most women, the doping tests that they fail are around appetite suppressants, ways to lose weight, because women can't afford to blood dope like Lance Armstrong. It's actually really expensive to be a cheat. So being around that, I just thought, is this normal? Is this normal for her? Is this what all my teammates are going to be like? Everyone must think I'm a very fat cow, weighing in at 67 kilos as I did then. They must think I'm not committed enough. So it becomes testing, and I think we see this sometimes in other aesthetic sports like dance, gymnastics is everyone sees all of your body when you're in lycra. And we'd say it, we'd kind of validate like, oh, wow, she looks amazing. Like, look how skinny her legs are. She's going to race well. So there's this absolute link between appearance and expectation of performance. And I think that sets a really challenging tone. Now, that said, there were also some amazing riders, and this is the beauty, if I'm to generalise about Dutch riders, is they're generally taller, generally heavier, and they're strong and hard as nails. So it wasn't so much about just being light. They were also racing smart. They were strong. They trained smart. And so it was really important because Italian girls, again, to generalise, are smaller and they focus on climbing. So I was in the wrong team. You know, if I'd ridden in with Dutchies or Belgies and been in a different place in flatter country, I'm sure my experiences would have been different.
What I can see, there's two different types of riding. There's road cycling and then there's is it velodrome?
Yep, track cycling.
Track cycling. So when I think of female cyclists, I think about track cyclists, and I do see them as being solid, not being skinny, being like very muscular, particularly in their legs and their thighs. Is that not the same body type that's required for road cycling?
That's correct. A track cyclist like Anna Meares, who's arguably our most decorated bike rider from this country, she's an extraordinary athlete. But you're right, you look at her physique, she's not very tall, beautifully explosive butt and legs. You know, she needs to be crazy powerful.
There.
And that means that she can be track standing up high and then accelerate and get to 60 kilometres an hour within a lap. And we've seen her win the Keirin and other races. So that, if you think about fast twitch fibres, slow twitch, if we think about track sprinters like 100-metre runners, they need all those fast twitch fibres. That's what Anna Meares has. So if you said to Anna, go and ride 100K, it wouldn't be useful for her training and she wouldn't do it very well. But if you said, go and generate, 2,000 watts on that stationary bike, she'd nail it. In road cycling, you need endurance. You need to be able to have a lot of type 2 fibres, those slow twitch fibres, type 1 fibres, and you need to be able to keep going at a certain pace. That's probably about 60 or 70% of your maximum. And you can do that. And that's what Cadell was amazing at. He could do that all day long.
What about when Lance Armstrong happened? What did that do to cycling as a sport and everyone that was in it?
I think everyone was in it already knew, and for a lot of men who were part of that process, as in they witnessed it, they either did it themselves, they just were never as high profile, no one was surprised. I think I was in the US at the time, and I remember sitting down and watching that interview with Oprah in 2012, and I was surprised that he said yes to everything, in that opening set of questions when she just said, okay, yes or no. But I think the people who felt most betrayed were fans who just felt like he embodied everything they wanted, which was, a white American, Texan, God-loving, cancer-curing. So for a lot of the Western world, because the Euros didn't adore him the way the Western world did, he symbolised so many things. And
was he liked within the cycling community?
No. I mean, he acknowledges that people thought he was an a-hole and he treated people poorly. I mean, when you listen to him now, he's got a podcast, he talks about the tour a lot. He offers great insights, but you can tell he's had a lot of therapy. He talks about having family therapy. He's trying to reconcile with people he's hurt. But he's still an amazingly arrogant person, and you have to be to have that series of performances over that time and to either scare, intimidate or bribe or pay people enough to do whatever you wanted. Because as we saw with Cadell, winning the Tour is pretty hard. Doing it 7 times in a row, it wasn't just the doping, it was being powerful, manipulative, telling which journalists could be in press conferences, intimidating riders who were threatening to speak out. So he was a total bully. And yet you got a sense, though, there was this definite admiration in the peloton, like people go, yeah, he's a hard-ass butt. And interestingly, I think that that's where gender comes into it around likeability and poor performance. And that's something we're seeing more and more, is that with the professionalisation of women's sport in Australia, more women are becoming high profile. We have a much lower threshold for women being badly behaved.
Yep.
So particularly we're seeing with NRL players.
And tennis.
And yes, my goodness. Now imagine if Ash Barty behaved like Tomic in a press conference and, was bored and bagged people out and was rude. She wouldn't have a career and she wouldn't have sponsors. Whenever Liz Cambage, the basketball player, says something slightly foolish, the world's really quick to pile on. But if Andrew Bogut says something foolish, people go, Bogut. So we're okay with accepting meanness and bad behaviour and date rape and, drink driving. We hold our female athletes to a much higher standard, and that's a burden. That's a real pressure. And we saw that in cycling when we were over there, is that women are there having to blog and post on social media and like, hi, I'm doing this thing, it's really hard. And you'd think if some of the men were just able to say, oh, did you see my teammate, my countrywoman won a race, that woman would suddenly have more profile and kudos. But everyone's very introspective as professional athletes, and I think they're all just hanging on by their fingernails sometimes.
How is doping seen within a sport by elite athletes? I imagine it happens in every sport. Is there just massive frustration that it's going on and it's not fair and we wish the world knew? Or is there just an understanding that that's how it is and you've got to work within that system?
I can't speak for the men who race professionally, but when I would observe the way those decades unfolded, I think there's this word omerta that they talk about, which is that everyone knew that it was going on and it was just not spoken about.
Oh, like the mafia talk about
exactly.
That. It's just unspoken.
So, in fact, during that era, that's what Lance used to use as his argument when he did get caught, was it wasn't just me. I'm not just the bad guy. Everyone was doing it. And everyone acknowledges that for a lot of athletes, they have at some time, if you were racing during that period, it's likely that, But I think that's where women's sport feels pretty maligned because they're being dragged down by the poor performances and the cheating. And that used to be the feedback. You'd come back every year in October after 7 months in Europe and people would say, so everyone's doping in cycling. And you'd think, well, no, I'm not.
That was the perception, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that also one thing we forget is that elite athletes make what they do look really easy. You don't see the 10,000 hours or the 20 years of preparation. So, in fact, yes, if you went and tried to race in a women's professional peloton, you'd say, oh, they're all probably doping. Do you think, no, they just spent 20 years doing something and they're probably only good at one thing. In the same way, if someone followed you around all day at work and they go, oh, my God, how does she keep across everything that she's got to do in her mind? And you think, well, 30 years of doing this and running businesses and being amazing helps me work out what's important and what's not. So we forget about acquired capability, and we see that in athletes a lot. So that's the first thing. But the second thing I think is that there are a lot of challenges around how to actively monitor people who are athletes. We have whereabouts systems. When you're an Australian athlete, you have a federation that are really good on monitoring you. But the Kazakhstani federation, they care a little bit less. Yeah.
Tell me about Genevieve Johnson.
Genevieve Johnson was a French-Canadian superstar who became an amazing cyclist in her teens and then controversially tested positive to performance-enhancing drugs at a young age, I think in her early 20s, and was banned for life. And then a few years later, an amazing story was revealed that in fact she had been in a sexual relationship with her coach, who was also married, and that he and his business partner had provided her with doping products throughout her teens and 20s. And she provided an amazing amount of evidence to the Canadian anti-doping organisation and in many ways ended up being a huge spearhead for around athlete abuse, but also uncovering a lot of doping challenges in that particular sport. And the reason why this became more prominent was she gave a really remarkable, candid interview to an Australian podcast journalist just 2 years ago, where she talked about how difficult it was to be a young woman in a completely abusive relationship, but like so many people in these situations, not realise that this wasn't normal or appropriate, that as a 15-year-old being coached by, mentored by, abused by and having sex with a man in his 30s and yet winning bike races and being number one in the world. So, and we've heard Jelena Dokic talk about this, that attention, performance, validation means that you then don't say, actually, this is terrible. I mean, when Dokic described, trying to go to sleep in the players' area at 11 p.m. because her father had locked her out of the hotel for coming second at Wimbledon, made my heart break. And I confess that, like a lot of Australians, I probably thought, why is she in such a cranky mood?
Yeah.
So we don't see all the behind-the-scenes things that happen, and we know that women athletes, they don't have the autonomy and the leverage and the profile, and they're frequently looked after by sponsors and male coaches who then form this kind of bond. And look, most of the time the bonds between athletes and coaches are actually appropriate and professional and really positive. And I've had male and female coaches that have been brilliant. But I know that there are women who are in these situations where they feel like, oh, he's going to get me this opportunity. It's like having a manager or you want to be a rock star or you want to be an actor, and he's, Ryan Adams.
So do you think that she was the Me Too moment that cycling needed to have?
I think it's not happening enough yet. I think that there are still some challenges around the value and capability of women cyclists, and the fact that the ASO, who organise the Tour de France, are still bickering about whether there's value in showing 2 weeks of women's bike racing more than just one day means that we're not hearing it loudly enough yet. And even though we think that, cycling is a global sport, it's not necessarily a high profile, and even, your descriptions early on, it's not a very accessible sport. So people don't think, oh, that could be me, because it's actually, it's kind of left of centre and it's hard and it's not very cool. That being said, being a footy player or a netballer or a basketballer, they're sports that more women have played, and I think that the coach-athlete dynamic is actually a universal problem. But I don't know if there's been enough microscope being placed on elite sport and young women being exploited just yet.
More to come on that. Your book's called Life and Death, and you write about how there are not a lot of sports or hobbies where every time you want to participate in it, you have to accept that I might die today doing this thing that I love. And yet with cycling, that's really the case. Tell me about some of the women you've known who've tragically lost their lives while cycling.
The first person was a woman whose name became kind of catapulted into everyone's consciousness, Amy Gillett, because of the circumstances under which she was killed. She and her teammates, all the Australian national team, a team I rode for 2 years later, were training before an event, and their group was struck by a woman who'd lost control of her vehicle, a young woman in Germany. And tragically, Amy died quite suddenly, and yet her teammates were also critically injured, 2 of whom nearly died. My coach, Warren McDonald, who I'd not met at the time then, was driving behind them with a mechanic, and he witnessed this whole thing, and then he was there in a foreign country trying to generate helicopters and galvanise medevac teams for 6 critically injured women. I cannot imagine how that process unfolded, although as an emergency physician, you get into a groove. You actually, and I know he did this because there were people who said that he just you just look like who's the person at the most risk and who's least, and let's prioritise it that way. That suddenly brought women's cycling to people's consciousness, and in a tragic way, but it also was really remarkable. I remember getting daily updates in the paper about a lot of those riders, and I went on to know a couple of them really well. Alexis Rhodes became a teammate of mine, and she'd been very seriously injured in that crash. And so suddenly everyone thought, oh gosh, this is dangerous. Women shouldn't ride because they can get killed, and you think, well, men have been getting put into dangerous situations for a long time. But it also, it was in many ways the positive spin-off was the Amy Gillett Foundation. Her late husband, Simon Gillett, established a foundation that then began to focus on road safety. And they've been a huge driving force around the Meter Matters campaign and safety in Australia. But it left a real legacy. There was a hole, really, in the women's national team. And, in fact, that's where talent transfer programs came from. And I was one of those people that then, they needed, how will we build up the depth of women's cycling again? And then there were some other just absolutely crushing things that happened to teammates. And as you said, we become selfish because we think that could be me. I had a wonderful teammate, Australian woman called Carly Hibbard, who lived in another Italian town just a little south from me, and we both were riding for completely shitful teams. So every race at a car park, you're standing around, there's a team bus, and you stand there and you go over and you go, oh my God. What happened to your team last week? Our team director burst in and did this. We used to be, we just chat. We weren't really close, but I really liked her. And on the second day of the Giro d'Italia in 2011, she was not in the race. She was training near Lake Como, near where her team was based, and she got hit by a car and died instantly on a road that I trained on every week. And then I was asked to give information back to her boyfriend Cameron in Brisbane, and then asked to speak to the peloton and tell them all on the opening stage. You know, you see often at the start of a bike race there'll be 150 people there all on their bikes ready to go, and maybe the mayor of the town is there and balloons get set off, and it's a really lovely event. But for this time we got all the Australian riders that were in the race to come to the front, riders like Rachel Naylor and Amanda Spratt, very high profile riders. And they said, could you please address, the whole peloton in Italian and English, if you don't mind, and speak on behalf of the Australians. And it was just, it was awful. I mean, I cried the whole time. And I felt devastated. And I felt also like this should, we all say this, but this should not have happened, and that could be me tomorrow. It could be one of us in this race. So even though the better you get as a bike rider and the more evasive you can be when things go astray, and I certainly do, I ride every single day in Australia, you get good at being defensive and careful. You cannot control someone who's on their phone or, on the wrong side of the road when you're going down a hill at 50k an hour. So that was really traumatic, and a close friend of hers just really struggled after that and was unable to train and race again. She was traumatised, which is totally understandable.
Sure.
And a third really important close person to me, Amy Dombrowski, an American rider whose house I'd been sitting in Colorado. She again was hit by a car in Belgium in a town where I was arriving to 2 days later. And when I got there, I was there to do a race that I was trying to qualify for the Commonwealth Games in 2014. And I was there on my own. And I found out the day before I left. And Amy was this woman who just was filled with like this great energy, this American Colorado energy. She was a cyclocross rider, which means she races in the winter on that snow and mud as well. Cheerful, noisy, enthusiastic, relentless, a brilliant athlete, but a good citizen. And there's so many aspects of traumatic death and people close to you where you think, what if she turned the corner 30 seconds later? What if? We all do that. And then when I arrived there, I thought, I can't do this. I can't train on these roads. She was just killed around the corner. I don't feel safe here. I was on my own. My boyfriend at the time, who's just terrific, I remember calling him on FaceTime every day going, I became anxious about my bike. I said, I don't think the brakes are working. I don't think so he was there trying to counsel me from Melbourne while I was in Belgium trying to prepare for a race that I thought I'm old and I'm 40, but I want to go to the Glasgow Commonwealth Games. And I didn't win the race and I didn't qualify for Commonwealth Games. And so it's just one of my more failures and disappointments. But it also made me think, oh God, there is just more to life than trying to be an athlete. It's, as I said, it's so selfish, and you think we're not always being mindful enough when we're doing it. We're not always actually enjoying the privilege of having a body that works and responds the way we want it to, of travelling, of freedom, of not being in a little cubicle in a job we don't like with a boss we don't like. I mean, there are so many liberties of being an athlete, particularly in cycling, where you're seeing the world, and we don't always appreciate them. I know I didn't always appreciate them.
How did you know when it was time to let go of the dream?
I didn't get another contract. I couldn't afford to keep paying for myself to race in the US. I was too old, too fat, too slow, as you said.
As a coach said. I didn't say it.
The coach is the dude with the power, though, yeah? So what he's saying is, I'm putting a line through your name. You will not get selected for Australia again. So someone
else made the decision for you?
Yeah. And look, they do that. I see now how hard it would be to be a high-performance coach. He's there trying to win gold medals for Australia every 4 years, and he needs to narrow his list of 50 potentials down to maybe 5 maybes to invest in. But trust me, being on the other end of that conversation in a shitty little cafe in Italy is devastating, because you're thinking, no, give me one more chance, give me one more audition, give me one more race, but no, he's trying to make his life easier. So I came back to Australia and I managed a team here in the National Road Series, which I loved doing, and I actually raced really well because I realised I'd become quite a good bike rider and I enjoyed it. But there was still this one thing that I wanted to be extraordinary. I wanted to be the best in the world at something. And I went to the 2015 National Champs and I was gutted that I was in the best form of my life, and I was 41, working full time, and I came second in the National Championships, and I felt so ripped off.
That's pretty amazing.
What a loser. Silvers are always the crankiest, you know that. Yeah, bronze are happy to be there. Silver's like, fuck. And so I thought, this is bullshit. I'm better than this.
Damn it.
So I set a big plan, and it was audacious, but I really decided to have a crack at something big.
And then what happened?
Well, I decided to try and break the hour world record, which was an event that I'd never ridden on a track before, on a velodrome, never ridden on a track bike, didn't have any equipment, didn't have a coach. My coach said, I don't think you'd be very good at that, so I had to find someone else. And then this process just unfolded over a year. I just thought, you know what, this is a problem. All I need is people to help me solve it. I need the right people to help me solve it, and it's going to be shitty and bumpy all the way along, but I'll just try and work that out. And it was really hard. Physically, financially, it cost me a lot of money, the hours and the time and all that stuff, and then you doubt yourself. And I had this total crisis of confidence in the days before, thinking, I can't do this. It's going to be live streamed all over the world. Thousands of people are watching in the Superdrome. If I don't do it, they're all there to witness it, my disaster. I've got 1 hour to ride as many laps as I can on my own with my head down and in one position. And if I don't break the record, that'll all go, well, see, this is why she never went to the Olympics, because she's a loser.
That's a lot of pressure.
I know. It is a lot of pressure.
What was the day itself like?
The day was amazing. And I'd worked really hard with this sports psych about mindful cueing. You know, how do I acknowledge, that's the beauty of mindfulness, that thing like, okay, I'm in pain. Anyway, back to pedaling, or sweat dripping down my face into my eyes. That's annoying. Anyway, back to the thing I was doing, instead of thinking all the negative rhetoric that we can. You know how easy it is in any situation where you think, oh, this is rubbish. I shouldn't have tried this. Oh, I'm useless. And that then, of course, affects your physical performance. So we'd worked on this whole script of things he wanted me to think about for those times, checking in on how I was going, and that idea that you notice that you're in pain, but you're not going to stop riding, so you just keep riding. And it was the most beautiful 1 hour flow, and we talk about that in sport, that I've ever experienced. And I could hear them commentating, I could hear people cheering, I could look at the clock and go, that was good. And I rode like a metronome, which is what you need to be. You need to not be that amazingly fast or whatever. You just need to be steady. And it was just the greatest sporting performance of my life because of all the lead up, all the process, the sacrifice, the challenge. It gave me that confidence that I thought, actually, anything is achievable. I know that sounds a bit Muhammad Ali, but basically there is no impossible. You just have to set out where the hurdles are, bring in the great people. I mean, that's what you're really doing. You're bringing in all these people to be your expert in the aerodynamics and your expert in nutrition and your cold vest person and this amazing sports med woman who knows about menstrual cycle and athletes, there's nowhere near enough research around that. So bring in all the smart people, and then all I have to do is ride. And that for me was my greatest achievement.
Did it satisfy you?
Totally. And then the record got broken really soon after by a professional athlete at altitude because, she had more money than me. And she lives in Colorado.
How did that feel?
Oh, I felt annoyed, basically, because I thought, that's not, hang on a second, you're at altitude, I was at sea level. But then I thought, actually, to quote Sergei Bubka, who broke the world record in the men's pole vault hundreds of times, he said, records are there to be broken, not to be held. And I could then invest a whole lot more money and time and break it again, and then someone more talented than me should break it.
So how do you know when to stop?
I think when you've had enough failures and disappointments that you actually are celebrating the process and what you learned. I wasn't learning enough when I was in Italy at the time. I wasn't appreciative enough because I was so busy looking over there in the distance of where I needed to be that defined success. And I've certainly, of anyone who's seen that amazing episode of Insight where they had 4 Olympic gold medalists sitting there on a panel, and Lauren Jackson, Matthew Mitchum, them describing their depression and their anxiety that came afterwards. And it was such a revelation for me because I thought, oh, cool, okay, it actually isn't the answer. The winning isn't the answer. I know I sound like an old person now, but it's the getting there and the failures and the people and learning how to cut crappy people out of your life and how to hold tight to the amazing people and to reflect, get lots of feedback. I mean, that's what's brutal about being an athlete, people telling you you're not good enough. And yet in many ways it helps you think, okay, cool, what do I need to be good at then? What do I need to work on? What are my totally, fatal flaws? Work on your fatal flaws, but you don't have to be good at everything. And I don't need now to win everything or anything anymore. So now I'm trying to be the best that I can be at my job, but I also know that I'm going to stuff it up some days.
What does life look like now for you?
Oh, it's a little bit exhausting. I'm trying to learn government. It's harder than it looks in Utopia. Far out. It's an amazing, I had this extraordinary job and I realise it's a real privilege, but it's quite overwhelming. It's trying to change the way we think about women in sport. We're trying to change culture. So while we're trying to help grow participation and get better facilities and have more women in leadership, what we're really trying to do and what I experience every day is how do we educate people, and they're generally white, straight men who run sport and particularly community sport, to think differently about what women's value is. They don't need to be sitting in the back of the canteen chopping tomatoes. They could actually be the head coach or the president of the club. We could have a woman coaching an AFLM team because she's the most experienced, not because a woman can't coach men's footy. And so we still have some challenges in Australia broadly. We see it in politics, we see it in medicine, we see it in business, that people think that there's, and this is what we call toxic gender stereotypes, that this is what men can do and should do and what they should look like and what they shouldn't talk about. Men shouldn't cry on the footy field. Oh, women are fine with crying, but they don't know how to be authoritative, or they don't know how to cope with stress. And yet we know that those things are rubbish. And so we need to see that change the landscape, because the more women you have in visible leadership positions in sport, holding a whistle or running the team or being the head coach, that's very powerful imagery. There's a beautiful picture of Becky Hammond, who's an assistant coach in an NBA team over in the US. So she coaches men's basketball. She used to play for the US. There's this great photo of her looking up to some 7-foot player, and she's an absolute gun at what she does. And all these men are standing there like, Becky's talking, shush. And yet when she was going to interview for a head coach job, be the first woman to ever interview for a head coach job, all of it was like, hey. She can't go in the locker room, and what do you mean that woman can't coach? You think, why? Who says? And also, locker room environments have changed, thankfully. A lot of men don't want to walk around naked and have beers in the shower. Men want to be professional in what they do. So times are changing, and I actually don't know, sometimes sport isn't catching up. The way sport is run, I should say, is not always catching up. So I'm very fortunate to be in Victoria. There's a lot happening there, and we feel very proud of the work we're doing. But we also know that other states and other countries are kicking our asses in other ways.
Thank you for the work you do in helping to educate about what women can do in sport, with your book, with your day job. And, you helped educate me all those years ago, and I've never forgotten it. So, Bridie, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mia.
Oh, how great was that interview? I just loved talking to Bridie. It was so lovely to meet her, even though our first connection was under some pretty weird circumstances. When you're in one of those kind of maelstroms of outrage and you're on the bottom of a pretty big pylon, anyone who shows you the least modicum of kind of understanding or benefit of the doubt, you never forget. And Bridie did that to me. She didn't let me off the hook, but instead of just sending me a death threat, she actually taught me a few things. And my education in her hands about cycling has continued to this day, and with this book and with that interview. You can find Bridie's book, Life and Death, at Booktopia now, and I highly recommend you do. She's just awesome. Follow her on social as well. She's brilliant. And if you want to do something to support women in sport, go and watch your local female cricket team or AFLW team or league team. And if you have any kids in your life, boys or girls, take them with you. Remember, you can't be what you can't see. So let's start showing our kids more women doing sport. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Freedman, and you can sign up for my newsletter if you want to at miafreedman.com.au.